Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because, wow, we are looking at a piece of breaking news that is quite literally sending shockwaves across the globe. We're unpacking a massive geopolitical maneuver, one that suddenly bridges a 30-year gap in history. It involves a decades-old international conflict, the very highest levels of government, and a stunning legal move making international headlines right now in May of 2026. Now, if you follow international relations, you already know how incredibly complex the dynamic between the United States and Cuba is. But this recent development, it adds a totally new, really intricate layer to all of that history. This isn't just another headline, it's a precedent-setting moment in international law. When a nation takes direct action against a former foreign leader, it sets a standard that could ripple into other global conflicts for decades. Okay, let's dive into this. Because the absolute central mystery we're unraveling today is all about the timing, right? Why on earth would the United States take such unprecedented legal action against a former foreign leader for an event that took place decades ago? It's exceptionally rare to see the distant past and the immediate present collide so dramatically on the geopolitical stage like this. What exactly are the strategic calculations happening behind closed doors in Washington to make this happen right now? And, maybe most importantly, what does this mean for the people actually living through the fallout today? To truly grasp the magnitude of this news, we have to stick strictly to the facts, map out our timeline, and understand the deep political undercurrents driving this massive decision. So, starting with Section 1, the Castro indictment, the breaking news. To ground us in exactly what is happening right now, let's look at the immediate headlines. The United States government has officially and formally indicted the former Cuban president Raúl Castro. I mean, this is a monumental diplomatic and legal move. It is incredibly rare to see the U.S. take direct criminal action against a former head of state from a neighboring nation. Just think about the diplomatic shockwaves this creates. It completely rewrites the established rules of engagement. You don't just indict a former foreign leader without thoroughly calculating the international blowback. These news alerts are flashing across every major outlet right now, from the Associated Press to CNN, and it's totally resetting the current diplomatic landscape between Washington and Havana. But to understand the what of today, we really have to look back at the why. Moving on to Section 2, the 1996 shootdown, the historical catalyst. Let's move to the history and see how this builds up. We actually have to rewind exactly 3 decades. Back in 1996, a deadly and truly tragic confrontation took place in the skies. Small civilian planes belonging to the activist group Brothers to the Rescue were shot down by the Cuban military. It was a massive flashpoint of the era that resulted in a tragic loss of life and immediate international outrage. But for years, that historical anchor kind of just sat there, largely untouched by criminal courts, residing mostly in history books and diplomatic grievance files. Now, fast forward to early 2026, the geopolitical environment shifts, and we see the U.S. launching a renewed concerted pressure campaign against Cuba. And that modern pressure cooker brings us right to May of 2026, the formal U.S. indictment of Raúl Castro over that exact 1996 downing of the planes. We're looking at a 30-year gap between a fatal event in the sky and modern-day legal consequences. Which naturally leads us to ask, but why? Why issue an indictment for an event that happened 30 years ago? Why open up a historical tragedy right now, in this specific, highly charged political moment? After 3 whole decades of silence in the criminal courts, what fundamentally shifted? Well, to understand that, we have to zoom out from the history itself and take a look at the broader geopolitical strategy operating in Washington today. And that brings us to Section 3, the U.S. pressure campaign, the modern political climate. Because you see, this indictment is definitely not an isolated legal incident. It's a calculated mechanism within a much larger, ongoing strategy. We are currently in the Trump administration's 2nd term in office, and they've initiated a months-long pressure campaign directly targeting the Caribbean islands' socialist-controlled government. Now, when we talk about a pressure campaign in this context, it generally involves pulling a sweeping series of diplomatic, economic, and political levers all at once to squeeze a foreign government. As reported by the Associated Press, this sudden indictment of Raúl Castro is basically functioning as the latest salvo in this broader strategy. The administration is essentially taking historical legal channels and using them as a modern instrument of geopolitical pressure, linking past grievances right to present-day diplomatic tactics. Which takes us to Section 4, a fragile reality, the divided ground response. Now, as you can imagine, when high-level political maneuvers like this occur, they immediately generate a response on the ground. And in this case, the reactions are incredibly polarized. From the perspective of the U.S. administration, this is framed purely as a moment of justice and victory. We can see this super clearly in a direct quote from President Donald Trump, who stated that this is, quote, a very big day for Cubans. The narrative coming out of Washington is firmly rooted in the idea that holding a former leader accountable for a 30-year-old tragedy is a triumphant step forward. And that framing plays incredibly well in Washington because it projects strength, it decisively addresses a long-standing historical grievance, and it reinforces the administration's tough stance on the region, all while signaling to key voters that promises of accountability are being kept. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how starkly it contrasts the two prevailing narratives. What makes this whole diplomatic maneuver so complex is looking at these reactions side by side. While the optimistic U.S. administration frames this as a very big day, the immediate reporting on the ground in Havana paints an entirely different picture. CNN spoke directly with residents in the Cuban capital, and they are pushing back heavily against the U.S. narrative. From their perspective, this isn't seen as some delayed delivery of justice, but strictly as a politically driven move. It is just a fascinating look at how a single international event, an indictment handed down from a courtroom, can be processed in completely opposite ways depending on which side of the Florida Strait you're standing on. Let's unpack that reality on the ground in Havana just a bit more. The residents there aren't just skeptical, they're genuinely anxious. They view this 30-year delayed indictment as a deeply politically driven tactic by the current U.S. administration, aimed at disruption. More importantly, there are very real, everyday fears among the Cuban people that this move is just going to rapidly deepen tensions between the two countries. Sources on the ground describe this as an incredibly fragile moment in U.S.-Cuba relations, because for the everyday citizen in Havana, high-level political posturing often translates into immediate economic and social instability. They fear they are the ones who will bear the brunt of the fallout, worrying that increased hostility will squeeze an already struggling economy and create even more uncertainty in their daily lives. So, the crucial point is this. We are quite literally watching history being rewritten in real time. We're witnessing the dramatic collision of a 30-year-old historical tragedy with the modern-day geopolitical strategies of a new U.S. administration. And it is all happening right on top of a deeply anxious civilian population that feels totally caught in the crossfire. So how will this 30-year-old conflict reshape the already fragile future of U.S.-Cuba relations? Will this pressure campaign force the structural changes the U.S. desires, or will it simply escalate an already tense, unpredictable standoff? I'll leave you to ponder that one. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope mapping this out helped clarify the deep complexities behind today's breaking news, and I look forward to diving into our next topic with you very soon. Catch you next time.